this option. All right, should give everybody a little notice. And I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for tonight, Mr. Colin Budd. Colin focuses on creating forward-thinking solutions across a variety of emerging domains, including AI, information of things, 5G, edge, mixed reality, blockchain, and beyond. He's a digital advisor at Microsoft and has the immense pleasure of assisting enterprise customers in unlocking new value by transforming their offerings, teams, cultures, and industries through a human-centric focus, mindset toward what could be, and passion for empowering others to do the right thing, not just the easy thing. He's also a Cornell University graduate with degrees in information science and fine arts, and holds a number of patents within spaces of human-centered practices and creative strategy. He's also a speaker for the yearly LavaCon conference on user experience and content strategy, which is run by Jack Molisani, the San Diego chapter, who is one of our regulars at Happy Hour. And we're incredibly excited to have him here tonight presenting Cheat, Borrow, Steal, How to Build and Scale a Successful Design Practice. So everyone, please welcome Colin Budd.
Thank you all. I think he could also use Laura's help in getting down to one sentence to explain who he is. So I'll reach out, Laura. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. Some seriously great minds from everything I've heard and seen so far. And yes, as Rachel mentioned, I'm here to share a little bit from a very adjacent community, but one that I think we can all feel very attached to, which is the broad space of design, right? Anything that's user and human-centric, which is what we all do. So hopefully by now I've gotten this right after over a year of doing this. Y'all can see my screen okay, I hope?
Yep, just fine.
Perfect, great. Well, really, this is a chance to talk about scaling a successful design practice. Well, that means a practice of being sort of, designs in the institutional sense of aesthetics and creating wireframes, or as I intend to mean it for today and for the purposes of this presentation, which is really about anyone who is even remotely doing something for the benefit of an end user or a person, which I hope is all of us, and I think it is. So with that very much in mind, let me dive right in. You're probably wondering, why is this guy here? So as Rachel so perfectly put it, I'm Colin Budd. I think maybe my sentence, if I had to have one, just for you, Laura, is explorer and designer of emerging technology. That's the essence of what I love doing and why I'm here in this world today. And more than that, it's been a chance to try to find ways to fuse really just four things. It's design, technology, business, and psychology. I'm sure you all can very much relate to those kind of big topics there. But for me, it's always been sort of a ebb and flow of how can I fuse them well? When I was at Cornell, it was a chance to actually realize that there is oftentimes a gap. I took two different programs, one fine arts, one information science, and I literally was running across campus, taking off my smock after oil painting to go write lines of Python. And there was just so little overlap where it just didn't accumulate, where there's somehow I could combine all these things into one thing, that I thought something was kind of amiss. And fortunately, when I found myself at IBM, I recognized that, no, this isn't always the case. There are places, there are people, there are entire forces who absolutely want to find ways to do the right thing by being human-centric and by putting the human first before business decisions, IT constraints, whatever it might be. So my entire career from that moment onwards has been trying to find my way to get to the right people, to convince them, listen to people, talk to people, learn from people, and do the right thing for people. So I got really lucky. I found myself kind of moving up the ladder, working at IBM, going from just product design and working on really, pixels more or less, to being able to think about things strategically. How do you have the right handoffs between user researchers and then actual UX designers, and then UI and visual, and on and on. And from there, that wasn't enough yet. I think for me, I always want to find the shortest fuse possible. Something happens, a spark, and then a reaction. And very much so, I got lucky because I found a team at IBM called The Garage, which is exactly that. It's a spark and a big bang. It's a consultancy that really works in a way that feels akin to a startup. They use things like design thinking, lean practices, agile, kind of all those sort of nouveau, but they've been around forever, just rebranded type things. But the essence of it was a chance to work with a lot of customers, I think maybe some 60 plus in 4 years, around the world, 3 times I joke, and really helping them do the right thing by using design thinking, using design practices, and being human-centric, before actually thinking about technology or anything in addition to just finding a way to fix real world problems. And then 2 months ago, I landed my absolute dream job. I'm now at Microsoft, and I'm a digital advisor, which means I'm doing sort of that and really thinking about the business side now, which is how do we keep the focus on users and humans, but think about things like value mapping, value engineering, and really what does a roadmap look like to leverage Microsoft's platform and entire portfolio to bring the world tomorrow to today. And if at this point you're thinking, great, Colin, catch a breath, I thought this was about design, you're not entirely wrong. But as I kind of teed up a little bit earlier, I think design oftentimes has a bit of a misnomer attached to it. Very often people tend to conflate it thinking design is really around aesthetics, right? How something looks, if it's pretty, if it's not, that kind of thing. And that's okay. It's definitely within the definition as well. But that's a loose definition. I think to kind of push the definition a little further, I would say design is really problem solving. How you made it here on time today, the work that you do to really address particular readers' needs, what have you, you're all active problem solvers. And if you don't mind me lending this to you as a title, you are all designers, truly. And I think if we want to push this even further, design really is the intent behind an outcome. If you think about, for instance, maybe you've recently moved or the house or apartment you've chosen, the reason why it felt so perfect for you, besides maybe location or budget, what have you, is that you could see your life in it. And that's not by sheer luck, maybe. It's really because some architect somewhere knew exactly the type of person it wanted to attract for this type of community and really designed that space well to speak to that kind of value that person holds. And how lucky that we're that person. It's really, design is an intentional thing that leads to good outcomes. So when I say design here, design practice, what have you, what I'm really talking about in the broadest possible dimension is very intentional, human-centric problem solving. So it absolutely is technical communication. It's absolutely design in the purest sort of creating wireframes or prototypes or graphic sense. But it really is doing something that's intentional and human-centric to solve problems. So that aside, let me show some credentials here. I've been extremely lucky. I mean, going from art studio to lab to being able to see myself and be part of quite a few iterations of what it means to have a design practice across some of the largest and most interesting and complex enterprises I think I can point a finger at. IBM, I joined in 2015. I got to see the very sort of first paintbrush strokes of what design means to this enterprise. They started about 2013 trying to turn the ship to be more human-centric. Then in 2016, I was able to be sort of feet on ground with American Airlines, helping expand their own design program. 2018, I was able to help Duke Energy. I lived for a couple months in Charlotte, which was such a blast. Really build out of almost nothing a design practice. They did a great job with it and have really begun to have an all new life in themselves as a sort of innovative spark. And then a lot of other honorable mentions, but these are the big ones because I think these are enterprises that we sort of know or maybe just sort of are aware of. And the reality is if they can do it, it easily scales to any other group, be it a party of one or a party as in IBM was at the time, 430,000. So with all that in mind, I think the question becomes, great, good for you, what have you learned? And the reality is I've kind of come to appreciate that everyone has similar issues, more or less. So maybe, and I'm kind of getting a sense as we were talking earlier, maybe you're here because you have an inkling that, human-centered is the way I do it. I've been doing it for years. I want this to catch on. I want my entire organization to believe in this, much like I do, and have to stop fighting the same fights every day to make a case for it. So sort of a grassroots type of approach. Maybe you're sort of a little bit further ahead. You want to change design or communication, or whatever it might be, from being seen as the output, the delivery of something, and actually be more part of that decision-making process, right? It's identifying and thinking through what is the right problem and how do we address it in the right ways and then deliver on it. Or maybe still, and this is the one I think I see most often because a lot of people are really, really intentioned these days on being sort of human oriented. Maybe you're nearly there. So you have an established design practice that has the right people, maybe pieces, processes all in place. But for some reason, there's just something blocking it from really scaling or catching on in a big way. And I think the good note here, and this will be a short presentation otherwise, is that there's absolutely hope. And so really, if there's one trick to building a design practice that's truly successful, self-scaling, self-sustaining, and fundamentally culture changing, which is the most important piece, it's simply to, all right, so obviously this is a little bit of a joke slide. The reality here, y'all, is that I really want to talk about so many things in this sort of conversation. And I know there's not enough time. I'd love it if there were. But the reality is I'm going to keep it simple for today. But I want to also save a lot of time at the end for Q&A, maybe even bleeding into the networking piece of it if it's possible, because I really want to drive this conversation in directions that you all are interested in your own work, in your communities, in your organizations. So don't leave it to me to monologue. Let's have some good conversations at the end if that's possible. But for the purposes of the next, call it 20, 30 minutes, we'll keep it simple, and let's just call it that we need to cheat, borrow, and steal. Let me take this one by one and break it down. So when I'm talking about cheating, I'm talking about taking what works and adapting it. I think for us, it's important to remind ourselves not to start at square one. I love the conversation earlier about sort of how burnt out we are after our day jobs of writing and communicating technically, that to write in a flourish,al that's not even a word, sorry, y'all, but a floral way in prose and poetry is something that almost feels amiss. Going from a structured black and white thing to going to something that's kind of gray or even colorful, it just feels wrong or different. And I think the reality is sometimes we feel that we have to be creative or be sparkful, but this is one of those areas where you can actually kind of get a jump start and bootstrap a little bit. And I mean this because a lot of great organizations, ones that I think you all know and appreciate well enough, Stanford's design school, the D School, Google with their Google Ventures, if you've heard of Sprint, it actually emanated really from there. Luma Institute, IBM, our favorite, IDEO, Microsoft, they have all done incredible legwork to really think through, what does design thinking mean to us? What does being human-centered mean to us? What does design in its broadest sense mean to us? And more importantly, they've taken that, they've sort of taken it to the field, they've hardened it, they've codified it. And to their credit of each of these institutions, they've released in some flavor, in some format, a lot of great resources to the general public. Very few of them are behind a paywall. And this is really great, because that means that we're able to then go out in the field and look to these institutions to take things like methodologies, take things like frameworks, best practices, maybe assets to help facilitate a workshop, tools to use or not use, reusable assets, enablement resources and trainings, and even things like statistics. I'm so delighted to see that Forrester has a new report that really shows the power of being human-centric, the power of design thinking in terms of an ROI for a business. Things like that make a really valid business case if you're trying to bring all these things to a group that maybe doesn't work that way today, or maybe has tried to and doesn't really go well. And so to that end, not being entirely original for once feels like an oddity for us, because we're all very creative people. But realistically, we have sort of two advantages. We can look to these resources as being a template that we can draw from and use. And if you're a little bit further on in your design practice for your organization, you can also sort of map your own maturity to those of, say, Google or Microsoft or Luma or IDEO. Because you can see, okay, well, actually, they chose this path, and that's akin to where we were now, they were 10 years ago or 3 months ago, whatever it might be. You can see that and kind of find what looks like your future and start to draw connections to really help push that future to today. So take what works, but like I said, you have to adapt it. You have to make it your own, right? It'd be so nice if we could just copy and paste and call it a day. No, that's not fun. We have to make it our own. And I think you'll appreciate this point the most. You have to speak your language. I feel like this is gonna be therapy in 5 seconds, because I'm sure we've all had the battle of choosing a term that maybe was contentious, or realizing that a term was being misused. And we know once that word is out there in an organization, in the world, it kind of has some sticking power, and that's sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing. And what I see for a lot of groups and a lot of teams is they might choose a word really well intentioned because Google used it or IDEO used it. And the problem is something like, for instance, Sprint already has a connotation. Maybe a team's already using it to talk about a 6-week cycle to push something out in development. So when Sprint becomes adapted as something that we're doing for design and humans now, people have a wrong conception and maybe just sort of wave it away. So when you come to a design practice and start to actually try to formulate what does this mean, or how can I scale it, being really considerate, which I think you all definitely are, of your vernacular of linguistics is key. Because for instance, things like design thinking can have a negative connotation or a positive one. User research, maybe people turn their nose up to incorrectly. Maybe UX, UI, service design is used interchangeably when they're very separate sects of a broader space. I'll give you sort of a funny example, or maybe just funny to me. I've oftentimes walked into a client session, a workshop, what have you, and I'll have someone either from the client side, maybe a member of my account team, very, very, very well-intentioned, just tell me right before I'm going on, a second before, hey, just FYI, this team has done design thinking before. It didn't work for them. So just make sure there's no design thinking activities today. And more often than not, I'm thinking, okay, well, shoot, this is all a design thinking workshop. So I'll go to my deck, I'll just change a few words, I'll create a mental swear jar, and I'll literally go ahead and just sort of lead the same thing I was going to do, but just call it human-centered thinking. And invariably, a week later, 2 weeks later, I'll be in a meeting and I'll hear something to the extent of, design thinking really didn't work for us, but man, that human-centered thinking, it's amazing. It's going to change everything. And sort of the reality is just the smallest little change of language can really open doors. I think the biggest sort of takeaway there is that oftentimes it is so impossible to try to unteach someone to reteach them something. So don't create those battles for yourself. Just be really mindful of the language you're choosing when trying to build or scale a design practice. And the second piece of this puzzle when it comes to adapting it is really around fitting your organization structure. This might seem like a no-brainer, but really having a organization means that it's organized in a certain fashion. It could be hierarchical, it could be sort of all teams themselves and they report up to one person. There's so many structures and each one can or can't work for the right teams. The difference is you have to be really mindful of this in order to think about how you're going to really strategically scale a design practice. I'll give you an example from IBM because I think this is an incredible story. 430,000 people strong, a very traditional engineering company, right? Well, in 2013, the CEO, Ginny Rometty, realized we have to do something different to really push ourselves to be a little bit more, I guess, sort of differentiating in the market. And what they did so wisely is they thought, okay, we're gonna do an experiment. We're gonna spend 5 years, we're gonna throw resources at it, and we're gonna work to see if design can actually make a difference, move the needle for us, more than just sort of engineering alone. And what's really incredible is that the team that started this whole design program was very smart about their approach, thinking about the 5 years they're gonna have to really build this out and think of the experiment and show value. And what they didn't do is try to just open tons of recs across teams to flood them with designers. Maybe that would have worked, but who knows? What they did do is they realized, okay, we need to first establish a really well-articulated design program with just enough meat on the bones to get going. So they hired internally, externally, tons of talented designers at all seniorities, fresh out of college to, seriously, director and above levels. They brought them in and they sort of had this really great singular type of sort of boot camp, if you will, where they all worked as one team and they all thought deeply about what does it mean to be design to IBM. And so they had this great sort of ignition of really thinking through design and thinking through design thinking. And the important thing here is that they started to bring in teams to lead workshops, offering them just better outcomes, better user research, helping move the needle for each of these teams if they come together and spend 2 days, 4 days, 5 days workshopping. And so what happened here is they had this really talented pool of people. You have this really talented group of IBMers who are coming in now as this pool, being sort of indoctrinated on it. And then this team's going back, but really importantly, they'd attach a designer to this team to help them deliver on that work, deliver on the outcome. And the exciting thing here is that over time, teams realized how important that designer was, how important the design thinking process was. And they started to actually ask for their own recs to open up designers. And sure enough, you now have these teams kind of in the middle of the graph there, where they had designers fully embedded. And then in almost no time at all, about 2, maybe 3 years into that 5-year experiment, enough people had been exposed to design, enough people had been exposed to design enablement, enough designers have been hired that there was no longer the sort of sense of one core team and they would lend out of pocket a pool of designers as resources. Now there are designers fully embedded in these teams. And more importantly, the sense of enablement, it wasn't that people had to come to that team to learn about design. There were so many great resources for each type of learning ability, whether they're a visual learner, hands-on, that allowed them to learn about design thinking, human-centered practices. And suddenly they too could communicate really well the benefits and the values of doing things in a human-centered fashion. And so very quickly, again, almost half the time it took for the sort of experiment, about 2.5 years at most, IBM really turned the tide and became a human-centric design program. And I think they're still one of the largest in-house design programs in the world. So really thinking about the structure of it and working to understand that there are already a lot of blockers, but you have to start in a way that's going to be nimble and move quickly. And I think that quick piece is really hard because I'm sure of it, we're all perfectionists, but you have to put it into practice. And that's the most difficult thing, to kind of put your child in the open earlier than you want to. And that's where you have to start to borrow a couple of things. You have to borrow time, trust, and teams. Let me speak to that a little further. Oftentimes, I feel like there's sort of a deference for all the great work that's happening in IT and business, what have you, and to sort of slow down that process, which is sort of my own problem thinking is slowing down, to have them sort of step back from just trying to solve things and think about, what do the users really need? What do people really want? Is this the right problem to solve? And then let's move forward faster. It feels like an almost huge imposition. And so when I think about all the time that you're requesting of them, their trust, people from the team to come join you to do a workshop or to talk to you, for their attention, for their resources, for them to follow the methodology you're putting out there, that just seems like an impossible ask, even for one of those things. But the thing to remind ourselves of, and I think we're probably acutely aware of it, is that we have a lot to give. When you're doing something that's human-centric and by nature, you're really thinking about the right thing to do and trying to get people to think in that same fashion, you're going to unlock for them a lot of value. Identifying the right work, so not doing the wrong thing and spinning their wheels. The ability for the team to work faster than ever before, because they can strategize and prioritize much better and gain clear alignment sooner. And sure, if you have the resources for it, maybe someone's helping out with the design aspects, be it technical communication, be it actual visual design, what have you. And so I think when it comes to that give to get model, it's sort of a lot to sort of offer. And the other imposition you have then is, okay, well, when it comes to that time piece, if I'm going to do it right, I'm going to do a workshop. It's going to be 2 days. Maybe it's virtual, maybe it's in person. The reality is that oftentimes becomes an impediment that most teams can't get past. And I've seen this falter so often, where they want to do a workshop, but no one can commit the time, and it just falls flat. So my advice here is it's better to actually start small. And the other oddity is starting anywhere. Here's what I mean by that. I mentioned American Airlines earlier. Coming into this amazing enterprise and working closely with their design team, I honestly, my first reaction was, I can't imagine why. Because I know the designers, I know their services, I know that American Airlines are incredibly human-centered leaders, to the fault of losing sleep over just doing the right thing for their customers every day. And so for me, I was so curious, okay, one, how can we have help? And two, what could be possibly their issue? And the issue for them at the time was, we have a great design program. We have a great design practice, great designers, but it's not scaling. We're busy, we're too busy. We need to hire more people, but we can't communicate that value yet because, well, we're so busy. The reality was they were busy with the same sort of repeat customers. The same internal teams kept coming back because they knew it worked. They knew that user research really made a difference. The workshops really helped bring alignment. They understood the value. And so this team was doing all the right things, but they weren't able to really infiltrate the other sects of the business. They weren't able to sort of make the leap to other parts of the organization and get them excited too. So they could show a business case for really expanding a headcount and starting to move past that first sort of pool of designers into more mature models. So, and my very senior colleague did the right thing here. She sort of prodded them. She said, look, let me kind of just be a little bit of an oddity here, a little bit of an oddball. And let me just see if I can invite a lot of leaders who we've never talked to things like presentations, where we're showing demonstrations of what we did in a workshop. We're talking about all the great work that came out of it. And if that's okay with you, I'm gonna go run off and do that now. And she did. She set up a ton of different sessions, all these presentations to show the outcomes of our different workshops, and invited leaders who I certainly, my collar was sweating. I was just, whoa, okay, this is intense. These are C-suite, these are directors, these are SVPs. And by doing that, and by getting the right people into the room and having them there, even just for 10 minutes to understand that this team worked together, came with these outcomes, and we're seeing these great metrics, that was enough. That was it. All of a sudden, other teams, either from top down or just from being in that sort of session or the atmosphere of it, started to request for workshops. And sometimes it wasn't a full workshop, a whole 2-day thing, 5-day thing. Sometimes it was, hey, look, I've got 2 hours on a Friday with my team. Can you help us do some empty maps? Absolutely, we'll do that. We weren't picky. We couldn't be at the time. And all of a sudden, you had this sort of tidal wave effect, that water cooler effect, where everyone in the hallways was talking about design, talking about human-centeredness, talking about being sort of in these workshops, being part of this design community, being this co-creation space. And what happened was you had this intake request go bonkers. Everyone wanted one. It doesn't matter how remote they were to this sort of design epicenter in Dallas, they wanted to do something involving design and human-centeredness. And that was all it took. By starting small, not being picky, doing a meeting as opposed to a full 2-day workshop, all of a sudden you had all the people who were excited for it. And that was great because all of a sudden you had something that was equivalent to equity. You could now be picky. You could now make a case for headcount. You can now make a case for actually being discerning when it comes to your intake process and pipeline. And I think that leads me to my third point here. Really, it's about stealing things now. It's stealing hearts, minds, and bodies. And you're thinking, Colin, it's only Wednesday. This isn't even a happy hour. This is way too goofy. Like, nah. Let me change the slide. Let's call it, we'll iterate in the fly. Stealing our seat at the table. This is what this is really about here. And I know in our professions, we often have to steal a seat at the table. And this is another case for it. So this might not be unfamiliar to you. We have to be able to leverage success to scale buy-in. And when we think about success, it's nothing more than trust. And trust really is the capital for anything we do, but particularly for scaling and creating a self-sustaining design practice, a human-centered practice. And so when I say success, I really do mean trust here. You have to have people trust you that what you're doing, the time you're borrowing, the people you're borrowing, it's going to lead to better outcomes for them. And you think about all the work that you've done, you think about why people trust you, they give you the work they do, why you give work to other people, why you ask people for favors or to help you with an assignment, whatever it might be, it's because you trust them. Doesn't mean they haven't failed along the way, they've learned, but you trust them, they're successful in some regard. And so really building that trust is absolutely paramount. And you'll do that by starting small, starting anywhere. But the sort of hard work aspect, which can oftentimes be a bit of a turnoff because it is a lot of work, it's a second day job, is being able to evangelize outcomes, big or small. And to do that, it's nothing I think that we're unfamiliar with. It's being very tactical about always documenting, always measuring, and always sharing. When I lead a workshop, I'm constantly in consideration of who's there, participants, taking photos along the journey, either on Zoom and Teams, or if it's in person, physical photos, people working with a flurry of sticky notes and Sharpies, what have you. It's documenting that. It's documenting also the artifacts. What's being created? What are the things being generated through this time together, through this collaborative moment? But also, and this is the less fun, less creative portion, it's measuring. It's being able to know the right things to measure, being able to work to obtain a good baseline on where things stand before you injected, and then knowing how to continuously measure them so that you have a good indicator of the effect and impact that you just had. And that's not always easy to know exactly what to measure, how to best measure it, but it's its own sort of science in a sense. But having those measurements are really key because, as we all know well, that's the language of business. If you don't have those metrics to show and metrics to point to, you have nothing to stand upon, more often than not. And I think the last thing is the one that we most often tend to overlook. It's the idea of being able to share it, almost to the point of being ruthless about it. Just like I mentioned American Airlines, having that sort of senior designer have the good insight of, my goodness, we need to get people to be aware of the great work that's happening, and then they'll get it, and then they'll want to buy into it. Sharing can take a lot of forms. But the most important thing is making sure it's easily digestible and easily spreadable in its own right. So it could be that you have a multi-format approach where you're creating a PowerPoint that's actually now being served as a PDF, which you're demonstrating over a 40-minute call. All these things allow people to sort of enter at different moments and be aware of it. And also sort of leaves that, it sort of has a permanence to it as well, which is great. And so when you're sort of documenting, measuring, sharing, you'll find yourself doing a lot of work, and it's not always enough. It seems like such an absolute immense battle, and it is, but you can help reduce that workload by leveraging the people that you have, and more importantly, the people you need. You can think about some of the times in your life and in your sort of career path where this maybe has been applicable. If something is to spread, it needs to first be middle out, and then more likely than not, it's then bottom up and then top down. There are other flavors for sure. They're not always the right thing. Let me explain this. Middle out in the sense that if you are saying we have to be human-centric, we need to help our readers solve better problems. We need to understand what problems they're having, what have you. It's you who's championing that, you who's being an advocate of it, you who's building the practice around it, who's enabling others on it, and who's spreading it. Bottom up in the sense that people who most frequently will be aware of it or part of it are those who are contributors as well, no matter what function they serve. And only in sort of a rare occurrence, and hopefully with Steam, will you be able to actually get that top down. And the top down, of course, is leadership. It's those higher up who are able to say, yep, we need to keep doing this, or they can very quickly put out that fire and no more great human-centric work for anyone. We see this often. Oftentimes, it's so difficult to get to top down that it seems like an impossible task. But the thing that gives me hope, and I want to kind of give you the same optimism here, is that I promise you it's really easy, because out there amongst your SVPs, amongst your directors, amongst the C-suite, you name it, there are magic people. Now, I cannot take any credit for this great term. This comes from IBM. It comes from the design program. When they were establishing what it means to have design at IBM, what is that ethos, what's the practice, they also felt like they were David and Goliath, and how could we possibly bring about 430,000 people to be designers in the broadest sense? But out of the woodwork, people in the highest possible positions came out and said, yes, this is exactly the way we should be working. I've been wanting to do this for years. This is what I've been saying. This is great. We have to keep going forward with this. And they're magic people because they get it immediately, but equally importantly, if not more so, they have the giant platform where when they say something, people take notice. Their high-powered colleagues take notice, their LinkedIn network takes notice, but also those who are within or amongst their chain of command, whether or not they like it, they have to take notice. So when you have people talking about design thinking, talking about being human-centered, user research, what have you, that middle out, bottom up is so important, but that top down really, really is paramount to get right. And so you have to nurture them in the sense that you have to be able to give that magic person whatever they need to keep doing what they're doing. So maybe they need a client reference. Maybe they need a one-pager, whatever it might be. Yeah, it's more work, but get that to them so they can keep the conversations going and keep using that platform so wisely for your benefit. And when that happens, you have to be ready for that other tidal wave, because that's the magic spreading really fast. And this is the piece that I sort of alluded to earlier. This is culture change. And it seems like such a effervescent, intangible thing. And so on a very, very long red eye, and probably shouldn't have been doing this, I try to put this slide together because I really, really want to think through, what does culture change mean? And I've even made a disclaimer, because this is not the time to take screenshots. This thing is just, it's fluff for the sake of just demonstrating what I think culture change is. Culture change is essentially trust plus enablement multiplied by people over time. And let me break that down a little bit. When I say trust, again, it's success, right? It's building successes, building trust amongst people. When I say enablement, it doesn't have to be a full credentialed badging course. No, it's just getting people in that sort of osmosis way aware of why this is valuable, aware of the right terms, aware of what you're doing, aware that it's working, so they have more trust in it. And sure, getting them to actually get to the level of being a human-centered practitioner in a design sense. But, and this is so key here, it's over time. It's over a lot of time. It doesn't happen in a month, a quarter, not even a year sometimes. Look again to IBM, that 5-year runway, that's a long time in technology. It's a long time for any company to throw money at something. But really, they wanted to give it the benefit of the doubt. They wanted to give it a fair fighting chance. And so 5 years felt like a fair experiment sort of hypothesis. Will design thinking, will human-centered practices, will more designers help us move the needle in a productive way? And like I mentioned, it happened in at most 2.5 years, if not far less, but you have to give it time. But when you give it time, when you build that trust, and when you get people talking about it, enabled on it, and excited about it, that's when you have culture change. And it is when all these things sort of accumulate and coalesce so perfectly together, that's when you're able to build a design practice that truly is successful, self-scaling, takes on life of its own, therefore self-sustaining, and is in fact culture changing. So let me tie this all together in a sort of somewhat tight bow, I hope. Don't start from scratch where you don't have to. We all know well that taking things that are templatized, being able to bootstrap is really valuable to work smart, not just hard. Take what works and adapt it. Look to those who have done the groundwork for eons now, like your Google Ventures, like Microsoft, like IDEO. Look to the resources they've made available, see what makes sense for you, map your maturity to them no matter where you are, and make sure it fits your language. So you're not fighting any battles that you shouldn't be fighting, like trying to reteach someone something they already think is one thing or another, and make it fit your organization. Also start small, start anywhere. Don't be too proud about it. If you can get yourself in a room with people and make them use Post-notes and sticky notes to talk about the human involved, the center of all this for at least 40 minutes, you have done a workshop in my book. You have done really well. So start small and start anywhere. Make sure that water cooler effect, even virtually, is happening, because the more people talking about it means that you're going to have equity, because now you're having successes build up. You're having people talk about it. Your middle out is turning to a bottom up swell. And soon enough, with those magic people, with enough time, you're going to have that top down buy-in to say, my goodness, this is having a huge impact. We're now a human-centered workforce. Let's keep going. So in other words, you have to cheap, borrow, and steal. All right, y'all. I hope that's been at least somewhat interesting and exciting to you all. I've certainly really been very appreciative to be here today. And I'd love to connect. I think you all are incredible. I'm certainly, just the storied past you've all had, the exciting futures that you all hold, and the happy hours I'm definitely joining soon enough, if you don't mind. I'd love to connect. So you can find me. This is maybe a bad joke, but I'm easily stalkable. If you search Colin Budd or my alias XBud, you'll find everything about me you do or don't want to know. You'll find a lot about me. I'll also post my LinkedIn to the chat if that makes sense. But really, I'm just excited to hopefully still have a lot of time to chat, take your questions, and have a good conversation. But for now, I'll turn it back to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Colin. Can't wait to see your happy hour as well. And as we just one quick round of applause for Colin Budd once more. Thank you so much.
Thank you.